Hey everyone, welcome to Write On, the podcast from Final Draft. We are here to talk all things screenwriting. I'm your host, Phil Galasso. On today's episode, I had a chance to chat with Abe Sylvia, writer of the new film The Eyes of Tammy Faye, starring Jessica Chastain and Andrew Garfield. The film is an intimate look at the rise and fall of Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker's marriage and televangelism empire.
Tammy Faye, what'd you do?
Hello, Mother. This is Jim Bakker, my husband. It's all part of our mission to help people. Anyone who's hurting or they feel like they've been left out, God has a plan for us.
What'd he tell you to do this time?
Jesus keeps a taking me higher and higher. Jim will preach and I'll sing.
God does not want us to be poor.
Wonderful, a pleasure.
Now God has a voice in this fight.
Who's he fighting?
Liberal agenda, homosexual agenda.
Faith isn't political.
You can't talk to him like that. Jerry Falwell is a powerful man, Tammy Faye.
She's a firecracker, Jim.
If everyone watching could double their pledge just for 1 month, God loves you. He really does.
We're not doing anything wrong, though.
Is that a question? Tammy and I are undergoing the most vicious attacks.
Serving God don't feel like it should be a money-making opportunity.
You know, when I saw that clipping with my face on it, I thought for a second that you were proud of me.
Oh, Tammy Faye, you follow blindly. In the end, all you are is blind.
I just want to love people.
The devil's coming for me, Tammy.
Can we talk about Satan later, Jim?
Steve is a patient of AIDS.
I can't look at this. You need to get her under control.
I built you an empire.
Built you an empire.
Some people, they're just hurting so bad, and we just need to love them.
I want to put my arm around you.
And I want to put my arms around you, Tammy Faye.
Abe and I discussed what drew him to telling Tammy Faye's story, his research and outlining process, his work on TV shows such as Nurse Jackie, and more. Check it out. Well, Abe, Sylvia, thank you for taking the time to chat with me today.
It's a pleasure.
So, The Eyes of Tammy Faye, how would you describe this movie to the uninitiated?
Oh gosh, it's a journey through the life of an incredible woman who lived rather beautifully, shamelessly, made a covenant with both God and the wrong husband, and we follow her, through her journey with sort of these twin love affairs, one with the Lord Almighty and one with a fellow named Jim Bakker.
What was your first exposure to Tammy Faye? Because I remember growing up and just kind of this SNL version of her was, pretty prominent. But what about you? What was your first exposure to her?
It was probably a little bit prior to that. I grew up in Oklahoma in the 80s, and that's right in the middle of the Bible Belt. And while I wasn't raised religiously, it was all around me. And when that scandal first hit, it was everywhere. I wasn't familiar with her before that, but it certainly made a huge splash in the neighborhood. I remember everybody talking about it, and I was rather taken with this woman who I think initially I thought was sort of silly, but I was drawn to her. And I don't think that was just because she sort of exuded love. I think it was, an identification with somebody who's living in the public eye and facing tremendous humiliation and yet sort of forging through it. And I think as a young gay person, that was probably deep down what I was drawn to, even though maybe on the surface, I just, thought she was kind of funny and fabulous and sparkly. But I think it goes deeper than that. There are lots of sparkly things out there in the world that I don't gravitate towards. So, I think she spoke to a part of myself that I was actively reckoning with at the time, which is, how can I be my authentic self in the world, in a world that, 1980s Norman, Oklahoma really is not the place to run down the street in an Annie wig, which is what I was doing. So I think that was my initial exposure to her. And then over the course of many years, obviously, I remember the SNL stuff. And then I was reintroduced to her by the documentary, which I saw multiple times in a theater when it first came out. And I was just sort of obsessed with her humanity and the fact that she carried on, and, her life didn't, she didn't have the cameras on her every day. And she was living in a little condo in Palm Springs and just putting one foot in front of the other. And there's this sort of like being thrown out of the Garden of Eden kind of aspect of picturing this Christian woman, who kind of once was the center of this, Christian Babylon. And now she's living in her own Gethsemane, where she thinks God has forsaken her because, I don't want to say any more than that, but I don't want to disparage the desert. But I thought it was rather biblical. Yeah. It was still biblical, the existence she was living. And from there, I had written a screenplay on spec that Jessica was attached to do. I had not met her yet personally. When the phone rang, and it was a producer by the name of Rachel Shane, who works alongside Gigi Pritzker. She asked me if I was familiar with the documentary, The Eyes of Tammy Faye, and I said everything that I just said to you. She said, well, would you be interested in doing an adaptation with Jessica as Tammy Faye? And that was when I first met Jessica face to face. And she said what parts of Tammy Faye she was taken with. And I said, what parts of Tammy Faye I was taken with. And somewhere in that exchange, we found a common Tammy Faye. Well, there's nothing common about Tammy Faye. A Tammy Faye that we could author sort of together. She has to play the part, so her input was invaluable throughout the development of the screenplay.
When you're talking about a character, a real life person like this, but a character within a film, larger than life is a term that's bandied about, but, in a lot of ways she really is. And a lot of the other characters in the story in the film are as well. When you're, as a writer, what is your, how do you keep things tethered to reality when you're dealing with such an unusual character like that?
I think you just have to keep asking yourself the question: if I was in this situation, how would I feel? I think it's a very simple thing, but I think it's vital. It's where it's all going to come from that. It's not going to come from it's not going to come from the research. You could put factoids together and funny bits, and what you'd end up with is a collage. You wouldn't end up with a coherent story about, real people with real feelings. So in all my work, I sort of specialize in sort of emotional extremists and performative people as well. And I think because I have a performer's background myself, there's a way of, all my friends are Broadway dancers, right? So I live in a world of performative people who know how to crack a joke, and it's just part of their daily existence. So it's easy for me to sort of humanize larger than life people because everybody in my life is larger than life.
I love that answer. A story like this, there's a lot of ways you can tell. You're talking about a person's entire life and then trying to, distill that into 2 hours of a movie. For you, what was your way in to turn to take up an entire person's entire life and to turn it into, a movie like this?
Yeah, it was, I think in the final analysis, it was sort of two-pronged because my first draft had everything in the kitchen sink in it. And while I think it was like a real fun read, it wasn't a movie yet. And so, having to say, okay, what is the thesis of this? And for me, it's just girl meets boy. They invest in a dream. The dream goes wrong and it falls apart. Like, you have to find the access point for an audience that says these people are actually relatable to me. People watching the film have to relate to Jim and Tammy in the way I related to Tammy Faye when I was 12, right? So if you just say, this is every marriage that goes wrong on some level, any marriage that ends in catastrophe, it's like it was probably built on, a well-intended bargain and faith. And then there's the first crack and the second crack. And suddenly somebody breaks that bargain and, lo and behold, tumult. It just so happens that with these two, you've got this wonderful canvas that sort of gives the audience, I think, enough distance so that they can still enjoy the fact that they are essentially watching their own story. Mm-hmm. The televangelistic aspects, the prosperity doctrine, the clothes, the hair, the makeup, all of that stuff, I think gives the audience enough distance to let it sort of like seep in later, though. Oh, that film was actually about my parents. Mm-hmm. Finding the universal truth of these, what seem to be completely individualistic people, I think was sort of the first prong of it. And then the second was to say, let's not take a completely objective point of view with this. And so in making that sort of bold choice to say, we're going to experience Tammy Faye Baker's life as she experienced it, without the luxury of hindsight, without the luxury of, we have, 30 years of figuring out what really happened and make sure you get everything. It just becomes cumbersome. And so to say, this is a woman's experience of her marriage from her point of view. So as Jim may be having an affair, how does that feel to be that woman who may be suspecting it? We don't break perspective and legitimately say this happened. It's like, this was Tammy's impression of each moment. And that allowed us to kind of have some things fall away that would have been, sort of overtly cumbersome.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, obviously, there's the documentary, and there's years and years of television and print and all sorts of stuff. What was your research process like? Was it extensive, or was it something where you kind of had an idea for what you wanted the movie to be and you kind of just went with that?
No, it was extensive. I think that's why the first draft was too big and had too many ideas, because there's almost too much good stuff. I read every biography I could get my hands on, and some really wonderful, intellectually thoughtful books about, what went down. And again, then kind of putting it through that sieve of her point of view. And that is this part of the marriage story. Mm-hmm. Those were the guiding principles that let other stuff kind of, fall away. And yet it was all sort of there. It's like, it sort of becomes, at some point, the research becomes cellular. And by the time I was on my, second draft of it, I knew how my Tammy Faye Baker talked. Mm-hmm. I knew how my Jim Baker talked, and whether or not it was a verbatim. And there are moments in the film that are completely verbatim, because some of you can't do better than what they said themselves in many cases. But the stuff that's kind of invented out of whole cloth, I think there's a little bit of osmosis that happens, from watching so many hours of footage, and I can do some really good impressions of both of them. And, and as I'm writing the script, it's like I'm talking to myself as them. So I think, the important part of the research was to get it into my own DNA, and to separate that from like, how do I include all of these facts? I think that was the value of the ultimate value of the research.
Were there some of the stuff that happens in the movie and in real life is just so unbelievable? The idea that they would go on television and just openly say, we're in debt, help us out of debt. Things like that. Like, as a writer, was there anything where you're like, I don't know how to include this without having 30 minutes of exposition to lay the groundwork so that the audience even believes this?
I think if Jim and Tammy Faye Baker had not fallen, world history would have been different. You giggle. It's true. If, in my deep dive and research, the federal government knew what was happening at PTL many years before the Justice Department did anything about it. And it was for a very simple reason. It was because they were, the evangelical were in the Republican Party. They were in that big tent and supporting Reagan and supporting Bush. And Jim and Tammy Faye, Pat Robertson was going to run, and he was going to primary Bush. And Jim and Tammy Faye told Jerry Falwell that they were going to support Pat Robertson. And lo and behold, the Justice Department threw the book at them. And Jerry Falwell took over, and you kept the Republican coalition together. But could you have imagined if, how would world history be different if Michael Dukakis had become president in 1988? Mm-hmm. It's kind of amazing. I don't know if Trump would have been our president.
Yeah,
it's true. And, and it's, you think about in the long run, the lineage of Falwell and his son's involvement in the campaign in continuing to deliver the evangelical vote to the Republican Party. When I think, it could have gone a completely different way. And I just think that's interesting. There's no judgments in that. It's like, but that scandal, that affair that brought down this empire, it actually had kind of profound consequences. It wasn't just a silly tabloid story.
Yeah, it is an interesting kind of what if scenario if you play when you think about it in those terms. One of the things that I thought was really nicely handled in the movie is it feels to me like it'd be very easy to kind of be a little bit more judgmental or mocking of people with earnest religious beliefs in this day and age, especially when they're going on television about it and all that. For you, what was your approach to that part of the story and that part of the characters? The fact that they are genuinely devout in their beliefs, especially Tammy, at least. How when you're thinking about the character, how does that sort of filter into your writing without seeping into a caricature or anything like that?
You have to take the side of your character, and you have to make a case for them. Otherwise, you're writing. I can't write characters that I'm judging. I mean, I could, but that's not storytelling. That's a polemic. That's me trying to say something about something as opposed to, throwing these characters into situations and watching them try to get out of it. I honestly think that's sort of rule number one. You go back to Shakespeare, and he made a case for every single character in those plays. It's like the villain wasn't just the villain. The villain had a reason, and there was empathy attached to that reason. So I don't know. I've gotten pretty good at separating myself from judgment. I've really tried to take a humanist approach. I don't know if I doubt Jim Bakker would be my friend in real life, but I had to find my way into, explaining from a humanistic point of view why he did what he did. Otherwise, I think the characters come off as flat, or they're not people. They're just ideas.
That makes sense. What was your writing process like on this? Obviously, we've spoken about, there's a ton of research. There's a whole life story out there to tell. Was there an extensive outlining process where, you are starting with all sorts of ideas about, what that through line would be? How do you go from taking all of this stuff and then translating that on a practical level into a screenplay that can be filmed?
Well, it's tricky. Yes, there was probably a 30-page outline that I turned in before I went to draft. By the time I wrote the draft, very little of that remained. It is, I think outlining sometimes, I think in this particular case, the outlining process was very helpful in terms of me absorbing and metabolizing the research, and the physical act of having to write it out was a way of absorbing it, right? That said, oftentimes I think outlines, the times I've written from an outline verbatim, the screenplay usually arrives like a lead brick. There is this thing where you're wrestling everything down on the page for an outline, and then you have to wrestle it away from the outline so that it breathes. More and more, I'm not a fan of the outlining process. I think it does very little other than to help a writer manage up, I think that's where it's useful in the process. But, I've been on the side of things, certainly in television, where you hand in an outline and everybody loves it. And then I'm like, okay, great, you love it. And then you turn in a script that matches the outline and then everybody hates it. It's like, well, you can't hate it because I wrote exactly what you said you loved. And I've had that happen too many times now not to know that, when the script comes in, it's going to be different. And it has to be, because they're two documents that are serving very different purposes.
You mentioned you coming from the world of television. This is a feature, obviously. It's the process is different for you. Are you still someone who's going to set strict deadlines for yourself? Do you wake up early and knock out pages? Do you wait till the last minute and then, do 3 days and get a whole draft out of it? What's your typical process like?
Yes. No, it's all of the above. Like sometimes I write, very late at night after my husband's gone to bed. Sometimes I wake up very early, before the house kind of gets going. But I think that the deadline is the most important thing. Like there is, everyone says like the habit of writing is a very good thing, that you set your time aside, you do a certain amount of work each day. Ultimately, yes, it works. It's not practical for me. Sort of real life gets in the way. You have to make phone calls. You have other meetings. You have a social life. But a friend of mine says things take the time you have, right? If you have and that's not even about, this has nothing to do with procrastinating. It's like, if I have a year to write it, I'm going to write it for a year. If it's due next week, it's going to be done next week. And sometimes writing faster is just better. It's instinctual. I don't think waiting till the last minute is a good idea, but writing under pressure, when it's like, it's just, certainly in television, you have a script that comes in and it shoots tomorrow and it's not good enough. It's just not the show. And for whatever reason, it's usually not the fault of the writer. It's usually the fault of the room that, sent a writer off to draft and we actually weren't finished. We thought we were finished, and I've had very good writers, come back and written what the room came up with, and it just doesn't work. And oh no, it shoots tomorrow. And some of the best stuff I've ever written came out that way because not just because of the deadline. I think it's because you're just relying on your instinct and your experience, right? This feels right. That doesn't feel right. And you just push through, and it doesn't, because it's not being filtered through necessarily all the steps that you would normally have to take before something gets to the floor. It's like, this shoots tomorrow and we're never talking about it again, And so suddenly you have actors who are getting pages right at the last minute. They're flying on instinct. You're flying on instinct. And lo and behold, we're pretty good at this, and sometimes taking the overthinking out of something can make, for a more alive and interesting result. That said, I can't work in a state of panic at all times, right? So in some, and I guess, I would say that the outlining and the room time and all of that stuff, it's not unlike the research, right? It prepares you for the moment where you say, what is it now? It's all in our systems. And then that's sometimes that free fall where it's so in your body. Again, some of the best stuff I've done has happened that way. But that you can't start that way. You can't start with the oh God, it's due tomorrow, let me panic. I mean, how many eighth graders wrote their book report at the last second and it stunk? It's because they didn't read the book. And I guess that, maybe that's the metaphor. When I find myself in those situations, I have read the book.
You've read the book a bunch of times.
Yeah, exactly.
When did you first know storytelling, writing was the thing for you?
It's probably 22, 23. I was dancing in the Broadway musical Cats. I had a lot of time on my hands when I wasn't dressed as a feline. And with those idle hands, these stories started to emerge. I started having ideas for things I wanted to make, probably because I wasn't being called upon to do all the other things that you would do in the theater when you're a kid and you're doing shows, or at university, you're doing where you do the show for a weekend and then you start making the next show, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, I got to New York and I'm working on Broadway and it's like the show's set and you're just, that's an art form in and of itself to just sort of do 8 shows a week and keep it fresh. I wasn't good at that. I was bored. And there are people who have turned that into an art form and my hat is off to them. I'm not one of them. And I think my brain started to get itchy. And so I started writing, and pretty soon I had written all of these things and I had no way to make them. So I decided to go to film school and really kind of sort of recalibrate the path, because I could have kept going as a chorus boy. I had a really nice life. Those are my favorite people in the world. And yet I had other things I wanted to do. And I think not unlike the deadline conversation you were having, it's like, just the process of writing and finishing things. It's done. I'm not going to rewrite it. I'm going to write something else now. So I think things started to formalize a little bit more when I got to UCLA. But up until that point, it was sort of me finding my voice, when I wasn't dressed like a pussycat.
After you get out of film school, what were the sort of practical, steps, benchmarks for you to becoming a working professional writer?
I don't think there are practical steps other than to say, make sure that, you're doing your work. I think I think what happens with writers who don't have a deadline, don't have a practical deadline, right? They're like, I'm taking some time off to write, and then they never write anything. Or, because there is no inherent accountability in that, one can flounder. I certainly did at times. So the folks that, that I admire who did it better than me were the ones who were in a writer's group where they had to present pages and try them out on each other. And some of my favorite people in the world, they just did that for years until they got their crack. For me, I was trying to coming out of film school, I was trying to make a feature film. I had a script that had made the development rounds and was pretty popular and was on the blacklist, but it wasn't getting made. And I was doing odd jobs, and, I'd just gone through a breakup and I was totally depressed. And I spent 6 years, just gigging and trying to get by and not writing anything else because I just was so locked on getting this movie made. It's like, I'm nothing if this movie doesn't happen. It just kind of became an obsession. It's like, I'll just eat and take these meetings and try to get actors to say yes, and then try to get financiers to say yes. Frankly, I couldn't do anything else. And the funny thing is, when the movie came out, premiered at Toronto, it sold that night to the Weinstein Company. And then Harvey Scissorhands, did his thing to it. It came out and it bombed. And I was back to, I had done no other strategic planning. The movie was supposed to come out and, open all these doors, and it didn't, except for one. And it was a seminal moment where somebody saw my original cut of the film in Toronto. And that person was an executive producer on Nurse Jackie. And he said, what are you up to? And I said, I have no idea. Honestly, I have no idea. This didn't work out. I'm now 36 years old. I have a student loan debt. And he says, well, why don't you come be the staff writer on Nurse Jackie? And I moved back to New York after having left. And then now I've worked steadily since then. But none of those are practical steps. There's no clear path. And I just taught a screenwriting class at UCLA. And I think all these fine people wanted was for me to say, what do I do next? How do I get an agent? What kind of script should I be writing to get attention? I was like, I don't have any answers for you. It's a scary world. It's a scary business. You're trying to do something that a lot of people are trying to do. And the cavalry isn't coming. This isn't, you have to grow up really fast, because especially if you spend your life in education, there is a path. It's like, I study for the test. I do the test. I get rewarded, and and I think there are other career paths where it's like, okay, I study to do something, I graduate, I get that job. This isn't that career. And you have to be, just for your own sort of kind of humanity, you sort of have to just say, well, what I said to them, as they're looking at me and they want me to give them some kind of definitive answer. And I just said, well, I really care about you. I can say that much. You need to let go of the idea of being famous. If you take that out of the equation, you're going to be a much happier person. And just do your work. If you're in it for ego, you're going to be miserable because the gratification, if it comes, when it comes, it's so hard earned that it's almost hard to feel it. Unfortunately, when people ask me that question, I just get very dark. Because I just want to be a realist with folks.
And nothing wrong with keeping it real.
And I say that knowing I was very lucky. Somebody saw my movie, I got a job. That is incredible luck. That is not something I strategically planned for, other than the fact that I made something. And once I made something, people could find that thing.
No, it makes sense. The luck of it, the person catching that one, that screening of your cut versus the version that was ultimately released, just, I think kind of makes your point that how, kind of pie in the sky, how lucky something like that is. You've worked on a lot of great television shows. I wanted to ask you about one, because I've been thinking about it a lot the last few days, Hap and Leonard with the great Michael K. Williams. Can you talk about just working on that show? You were writer and director on it. Fantastic show. I think a lot of people haven't seen.
Well, I wasn't expecting this, because Michael was a very dear person and a complete and total humanist and deeply sensitive and restless and vibratory and electric. I remember once he had to do a scene with an actress who was well into her 80s, and we shot out her side first because, she's very old. And I said, Michael, do you mind if I sit in on your coverage? And I'll play Mima in your coverage. It's one thing to sort of sit at a monitor and watch somebody do something. It's another thing to be completely in it with them. And he's looking at me and he's playing the scene as if I'm her. And I was gobsmacked. It's that man was tethered to an essential elemental part of humanity, and it lived right in front of his face. It was right in his eyes. Like, I think that's why somebody like him connects with so many people, because it's all of the things you feel, and it's way out front. And it was hard to be him. It was hard, with the great actors. So often they have to live in their reactivity. It's what the camera captures. And I feel bad when a person has that gift and they also have to walk around the world with that gift all the time. I really feel for his family, and I loved working with him.
Yeah, I appreciate you talking about it. Last question before we wrap up. You've been at this a while now. Is there a lesson you've learned along the way you wish you could tell yourself back when you were at UCLA or right when you got out? Is there something you wish you knew back then heading into all this?
I think I would tell myself to choose to be a little happier through it. I don't know. I think I drove myself a little nuts. It's funny because, your passion and your ego and all those things that drive you to do the thing, to say, oh, I made something. Look, I was here. All the things that drive us to do this stuff is also the stuff that is also the stuff that makes life hard when you're a creative person. And so I think I would probably tell myself to get into therapy sooner.
Well, Abe, thank you very much for taking the time to chat today and everything you shared. Congrats on the movie. When does it come out? When can
September 17th.
Hope everybody goes and sees it. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again to Abe Sylvia for coming on the show. The Eyes of Tammy Faye opens in theaters on September 17th. And as always, thanks to you, our listeners. If you liked this episode, leave us a review. And if you haven't already, subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. For news about future episodes and more, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at Final Draft Inc. and Instagram at Final Draft Screenwriting. This episode was produced by Kayla Guess with help from associate producer Emma Vranich. Music by T. Kelly. Thanks again, everyone. Until next time, write on.